My neighbor's teenager kept jumping my fence to use my pool, smirking, "What's the big deal? It's just water." Furious, I drained the pool and filled it with foam blocks. The next time he jumped in, he screamed, "I think I broke something." But things got even worse when his parents showed up and discovered. You know when you think you've got life all figured out, and then someone comes along and flips your world upside down? That was me, living in peace in my cozy Scottsdale, Arizona home. I bought this place after years of hard work, and my backyard was my sanctuary, a sparkling in-ground pool surrounded by a tall wooden fence for privacy. I loved it. It was my retreat from the chaos of life. And then the Fergusons moved in next door. At first, they seemed fine. Mr. Ferguson was one of those guys who always had a beer in his hand and wore sunglasses on his head like it was part of his personality. Mrs. Ferguson was polite but seemed permanently frazzled, like she was barely keeping it together. But their 15-year-old son, Aiden, he was the poster child for entitlement. The kid had a cocky smirk plastered on his face at all times, like the world owed him something. I should have seen the warning signs, but hindsight's 20/20, right? The first time it happened, I came home on a Saturday afternoon, grocery bags in hand, and heard splashing. I thought maybe some neighborhood kids had lost a ball in my yard and were trying to fish it out. But no, there was Aiden in my pool lounging on a float like he was on vacation. "Hey!" I shouted, dropping the bags on the patio table. "What the hell are you doing in my pool?" Aiden didn't even flinch. He just looked at me with that smug grin and said, "What's the big deal? It's just water." Before I could respond, he climbed out, grabbed his shoes, and hopped the fence like he did this sort of thing every day. I was too shocked to even yell at him. I walked over to the Fergusons' house and knocked on the door, my anger bubbling just below the surface. Mrs. Ferguson answered, looking frazzled as usual. "Oh, that's just Aiden," she said with a nervous laugh. When I explained what had happened, "He's always getting into trouble. Boys will be boys, you know." "No, boys will not be boys," I snapped. "This is trespassing." She just kept nodding and smiling like I was talking about the weather. I could tell right away this wasn't going to go anywhere, so I left, hoping this was a one-time thing. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The next weekend, I was relaxing in my living room when I heard splashing again. My heart sank. I peeked through the blinds, and there he was, Aiden doing cannonballs into my pool. He had a Bluetooth speaker blasting some awful rap song and a soda can sitting on my deck. He acted like he owned the place. I stormed outside, yelling, "Are you kidding me right now?" He looked up, completely unfazed, and said, "What's your problem, dude? You're not even using it." That was the moment I knew I wasn't dealing with a normal kid. This wasn't just a bratty teenager, this was a kid who genuinely didn't believe rules applied to him. I marched back over to the Fergusons' house, but this time Mr. Ferguson answered the door. "What's the big deal?" he said after I explained the situation. "It's just a pool. Let the kid cool off. You're being uptight." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't even pretending to be sorry. I told him in no uncertain terms that Aiden needed to stay out of my yard, but he just shrugged and closed the door. At that point, I knew I had to get creative. Calling the police felt extreme, but I was out of options. I put up no trespassing signs around the fence, thinking that might at least scare him off. It didn't. Aiden kept coming back, and every time I confronted him, he'd give me some snarky comment like, "What are you going to do? Call the pool police?" I started losing sleep over it. Every splash, every little noise outside, I'd jump up and check the backyard. It was exhausting. I needed a plan, a way to send a message that would make it clear I wasn't messing around. And then it hit me, if Aiden loved my pool so much, what would he do if there wasn't a pool? The next morning, I drained the entire thing. It took hours, but I didn't care. Once it was empty, I called a local foam supplier and ordered a truckload of foam blocks. You know the kind they use in gymnastics bits? It cost me a small fortune, but at that point, it was worth it. By the end of the day, my pool was no longer a pool, it was a giant foam pit. It looked absolutely ridiculous, but I didn't care. This was about principle. It didn't take long for Aiden to strike again. That same evening, I heard the telltale sound of someone climbing the fence. I didn't even bother looking out the window. I just waited. Sure enough, a few seconds later, I heard the loudest, most satisfying scream. "What the hell?" Aiden shouted, his voice cracking in panic. "I think I broke something." I went outside, casually sipping a glass of iced tea, and found him flailing around in the foam like a fish out of water. "What's the big deal?" I said, echoing his favorite line. "It's just foam." He was so angry he could barely speak. Eventually, he managed to climb out and limped home, shouting over his shoulder, "You're going to regret this." About an hour later, the Fergusons were at my door, banging so hard I thought they might break it down. Mrs. Ferguson was red-faced and screeching, "How dare you traumatize our son?" Mr. Ferguson was no better. "You could have killed him with that stupid stunt," he yelled. "You're lucky he didn't break his neck." I calmly explained that Aiden had been trespassing on my property and that the foam was completely safe. "Maybe if you taught your kid some respect, we wouldn't be in this situation," I added. That's when Mr. Ferguson's face turned a deep shade of purple. He pointed a finger at me and said, "You'll be hearing from our lawyer." The next day, I got a letter from a lawyer's office. The Fergusons were suing me for emotional distress, medical expenses, and property damage. I wasn't surprised. They seemed like the type to blame anyone but themselves. Their claim was laughable, though. Emotional distress from foam? Medical expenses? Aiden barely twisted his ankle, and I had video proof from my new security cameras showing him trespassing. I knew this was going to get ugly, but I wasn't about to back down. I hired a lawyer of my own, an old friend who specialized in property disputes. He laughed when I told him the story. "This will be fun," he said. "They don't have a leg to stand on."